But death wouldn't come quickly. Stripped, staked, and left to the mercy of fire, ants, or blades, Apache torture wasn't just about pain. It was a message, a warning, a ritual of survival. In this video, we uncover the chilling torture methods reportedly used by Apache warriors, drawn from historical accounts that still shock us today. This isn't a myth. This is raw frontier history, as brutal as the land it came from. Torture was not unknown in the Wild West, with Apache torture methods telling one particularly gruesome tale. Honoring the land, the people, and respect were part of Apache culture, but some of the torture methods that the Apache warriors employed are still hard to believe in their sheer brutality and inhumanity. Captives, raiders, and any other unlucky person who ended up in the hands of the Apache could find themselves subject to some of the cruelest torture on the American frontier. Torture for the Apache was more a ritual, with some methods ceremonial and some ruthlessly effective. They ranged from hours-long public executions to psychological torture methods meant to instill terror in the Apache enemies, far before a single shot was ever fired. In this episode, we'll be uncovering 5 of the most talked about and feared torture methods used by Apache warriors. We'll be diving deep into some of the most notorious torture stories from the 18th and 19th century Apache world to understand how and why the torture methods practiced by Apache warriors were some of the most sinister on the American frontier. The methods reported by U.S. Army scouts, Mexican prisoners, Spanish, Mexican troops, and Apache captives in stories passed down through the generations might shock you. Let's talk about why pain, torture, and revenge were a normal part of Apache culture for centuries, and why some of the torture stories from Apache torture might seem familiar to modern audiences. 1. Torture method: honey and ant torture. One of the best-known torture methods reportedly used by Apache warriors involved both a huge amount of pain and a large anthill. Captives were usually tied to stakes, with their arms outstretched, spread-eagled, or face up, and placed directly on top of a large red anthill. The ants involved weren't your garden-variety picnic pests either. It was also a warning to the outside world. It wasn't just a murder, it was a show. Apache torture methods weren't just about extracting information or punishing enemies. Sometimes, Apache torture was a public ritual to show power or exact retribution for wrongs committed by enemy forces. Slow burning on a stake. The slow burn, especially as depicted in frontier journals and Apache prison records, usually involved binding a captive to a vertical stake. The red harvester ant is indigenous to the Southwest and some regions of Mexico. Harvesters are known for having one of the most painful and excruciating stings on the planet. Fun fact: I was once stung by 3 red harvester ants in a row, and I still shudder when I hear their telltale rustling in the grass. Victims were sometimes slathered in honey, animal fat, or other sweet substances to attract more insects, to up the ante on the pain. Reports from U.S. Army scouts, Mexican prisoners, and Spanish Mexican troops place the time of this process anywhere from a few hours to days, if the ants took their sweet time by slowly marching their way all over the body. Dehydrated, immobile, and slowly dying of insect bites, swelling, and blood loss, captives were said to be roasted alive in the desert sun. Reports from New Mexico and Texas Apache bands indicate this torture method was used on certain offenders, such as captured soldiers, raiders, and those who had victimized Apache women, elders, and children. Captives would have their limbs stretched upward or tied over a slow-burning fire, but the fires were generally kept low, rarely directly on the skin, to keep death at bay for as long as possible. Fires were often built low to the ground, and the flames would sometimes only reach the lower half of the body, essentially cooking the flesh before death, and in some cases, taking hours to finish. Accounts by U.S. Army scouts, Mexican prisoners, and Spanish Mexican troops suggest that different parts of the victim's flesh would sometimes char or peel off before the captive finally succumbed to exhaustion or heat. Apache torture rituals were often accompanied by dancing, chanting, and even baiting or jeering as the captive slowly died in the sun. Torture on a stake was generally reserved for particularly egregious acts like killing an Apache leader, desecrating sacred grounds, or betraying an Apache alliance. Of note, the torture and execution methods described by Apache captives and soldiers were not universal, and many were likely to have occurred in the context of revenge killings or Apache intertribal justice. Scalping was common all over the American frontier, and a practice employed by Native American tribes and colonial powers alike. But for the Apache, it wasn't always instantaneous, and there were several reports of captured enemies being flayed or having strips of skin removed from their arms, legs, or chests before being finally dispatched. Captives who had been tortured or mutilated were usually scalped as the final stage of the execution process. These scalps were sometimes worn on spears or paraded around by Apache warriors in ceremonial war dances. Apache scalping rituals were often tied to beliefs about honor or taking the strength or soul of one's enemy. In some cases, young warriors in training were tasked with conducting torture and executions. This was both a rite of passage and an endurance test to see if the young warrior had the stomach to carry out these duties in the future. The cuts and wounds were not necessarily meant to kill, but rather to humiliate, to mark the enemy, or to appease the spirits of the dead, made to suffer. Perhaps some of the most psychological torture methods employed by Apache warriors and by other Apache enemies were the psychological torture methods used to break captives, sometimes known as Apache Hell. Captives, usually military scouts, raiders, or men from enemy Apache bands, were reported to be kept alive for several days, sometimes in the knowledge that they would be executed, but not how or when. In some instances, prisoners were offered food, treated with politeness, or even tended to by Apache captors before being suddenly whipped out to be executed in front of others. The sense of betrayal was profound, and broken trust meant that the captive's spirit was crushed and his enemies were left trembling with fear. These tactics were often applied to soldiers or civilians who had information that the Apache were after. Other psychological torture methods included forcing prisoners to watch the torture or execution of fellow prisoners, family members, or comrades. In some accounts, captives were even set free, but with a maiming injury, like an amputated ear, finger, or facial tattoo. Trial by stake was a slightly more formal torture method that had been practiced for centuries among Apache bands. While the most common use of these execution methods was reserved for Apache intertribal war or raids against white settlers, the Apache, especially the Chiricahua and Mescalero Apache bands, were known to capture enemies alive, often during Apache raids. Captives were often stripped, tied to a vertical stake, usually in the center of a public gathering space or tribal community, and subjected to a trial by public consensus. Accounts by U.S. Army scouts, Mexican prisoners, and Spanish Mexican troops tell of tribal elders, seasoned warriors, and even children playing a part in a captive's torture or execution. Trials often involved mock interrogation, punishment, or torture in increments, depending on the crime. Execution might include piercing with arrows or lances, burning extremities, stripping or branding, and finally, setting the victim aflame. Communal involvement from an eyewitness account turned these torture methods into both a warning to others and also a teaching moment and a final, painful punishment before death. Learning to kill it is critical to note that much of the information known about Apache torture methods and Apache warfare in general is Spanish and Mexican colonial accounts, Mexican, American military reports, soldier, settler diaries, captured enemy testimonies, biases of both sides, over-exaggerations, deliberate misinformation, propaganda, and outright fables to justify massacres, retaliation, or land theft have contributed to some of the widespread misinformation about Apache torture methods, culture, and violence. Apache culture, like many other indigenous groups of the American frontier, was not monolithic. Variance in beliefs, practices, and tribe-specific traditions meant that torture, interrogation, and punishment were not universal. Also, torture methods changed over time. The Apache faced generations of colonization, betrayal, displacement, and near genocide at the hands of Spanish, Mexican, and American forces. To survive in an increasingly hostile environment, the Apache had to fight against colonizers, white settlers, Mexican authorities, and each other. Torture and punishment were often ritualized, formalized, or needed for Apache survival as a people. Apache torture methods on the American frontier were some of the most fearsome and sinister in history. In an age of gunfights, deserts, and dusty forts, a brave Apache warrior with 2 fingers and a knife could strike fear into the heart of the nation. Apache torture methods were born of necessity, violence, and a culture of warrior honor, respect, and traditional codes of justice that took generations to evolve and adapt. Violence was complex and multidimensional, and some of the torture stories reported by Apache captives or Apache enemies were reactions to atrocities committed against Apache families, tribesmen, and women. Apache torture methods are a reminder of how fear, pain, and the human condition work together to create order and control. Torture is one of the oldest tools of war, and one that echoes across generations to give a glimpse into the past. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe for more true stories of crime, punishment, and the bizarre ways we treat one another when the world is crumbling around us. Let us know in the comments. What do you think determines justice in war? Do you think you'd survive the Apache code of retribution? Until next time, stay safe and keep fathoming history.